the Double Blind Magic Hour, where we cover what's going on in the world of psychedelics, from insider baseball drama within the rapidly unfolding psychedelic movement to the latest news on research, politics, and beyond. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Shelby Hartman, co-founder and editor-in-chief of Double Blind, a print magazine covering psychedelics. And today we're joined by Dennis Walker, a journalist and satirist. He's written for Double Blind, and he also puts out hilarious videos on what's happening in the wild, weird world of psychedelics. So if you want a good laugh and you also just want some sort of insider perspectives on what's unfolding within the psychedelic movement, I definitely recommend you give him a follow. Hey, Dennis, how's it going?
Great. Thanks for the opportunity here, Shelby. I've been a fan of Double Blind since its launch, so this is really cool. And hello, everybody listening.
We're stoked to have Fungi as the official sponsor of the Double Blind Magic Hour. Fungi makes psychedelic alternative chocolates and fruit chews activated with kanna. And if you haven't heard of or explored kanna yet, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful plant from South Africa that is growing in popularity. It is completely legal, and it's a very heart-opening experience. Some people use it as an alternative to alcohol. People also use it in meditation. There's a lot of uses for kanna. One of the amazing things about fungi is that they not only include kanna, but they also include other ingredients that are intended for sort of gentle stimulation. They're intended for having a good time. They can also be used as aphrodisiacs. They include a combination of kanna and also functional mushrooms in their products. And from my personal experience, I really enjoyed taking these. I had a friend over the other day. We took some fungi chocolates. We did some yoga in my backyard. And it was just like that gentle opening and relaxation that we were wanting as we wrapped our days. So whether you're going to a festival, whether you are going on a mushroom trip, or you're just looking to have a good time with yourself at home in your backyard, I recommend checking out Fungi. Podcast listeners can get 25% off their first order. Just use code DoubleBlindPod at fungi, FUNGUY.com. This episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Psyched Wellness. Psyched Wellness is on a mission to bring you the healing, restorative magic of Amanita muscaria mushrooms with their product, Calm. Calm is a unique, legal Amanita muscaria extract available for sale in the United States. It's been formulated by wellness professionals to help you rest, relax, and keep stress at bay, all without the high. You can get some Calm in your life now and save 10% with the code DOUBLEBLIND at psyched-wellness.com. That's PSYCHED-wellness.com. So what are you waiting for? Drift into dreamland with Calm. Your mind and body will thank you. Thank you so much for joining. I see you as someone who just really has your finger on the pulse of what is happening within psychedelics. You just spend a lot of time in community and talking to people who are working on a grassroots level every single day to try and put forth psychedelic reform. And so I thought you were just sort of the perfect person to have onto this podcast, because we're really trying to demystify for people what is happening within the industry among stakeholders who are really just at the forefront of trying to change the accessibility around psychedelics as medicines, the laws around psychedelics.
Yeah, well, we live in a hyper-polarized time right now in general, politically and globally. So it's no surprise that that's mapped itself on to the emerging psychedelic landscape, because it is a really pertinent, relevant, and deeply personal experience and policy and set of experiences for people. So I'm not surprised that there is a lot of infighting and wrestling for market share and jockeying for thought leadership. And part of what I'm trying to do is infuse a little bit of levity and laughter and joy into this to remind us of why so many of us see this inherent potential in psychedelics, which is that they can make the world a better place, a more colorful place, hopefully a more empathetic and tolerant place. But we have quite a few bumps in the road to get there.
Yeah, you have a whole list of, it's like the psychedelic onion on your website with headlines that are sort of poking fun at, what's happening within the psychedelic industry. I'm trying to remember some of the ones that I read, sort of jokes about, can you give me an example of like one of the headlines that was recently on your website?
Yeah, there was a popular one recently that says Netflix announces America's next top show.
Yes. That's the one that I saw. And it's so good because it's not that far off. And the archetypes that, I like that you used the word archetype because that was actually a word that I meant to use in the introduction for you, but I didn't. The archetypes in psychedelics are, they are real, they are hilarious. I don't want to offend anybody, but let's just say that, people often refer to a psychedelic movement or a psychedelic ecosystem. But when you really start putting your feet on the ground and familiarizing yourself with the various people who are invested in psychedelic reform, you realize that there's many different communities within the psychedelic community. So the archetype of person you're going to find who's doing ayahuasca in Costa Rica is going to be very different than the archetype of the Silicon Valley Burning Man, well-capitalized investor who met Rick Doblin on the playa and gave $1 million to MAPS. It's just a very different type of person. They run in different circles. They do different drugs. Sometimes they do the same drugs, but they also do different drugs. There's a lot there.
I call it the gift that keeps on giving, Shelby. There's so much low-hanging fruit in terms of satirical plot lines that, as you mentioned, a lot of times people are increasingly unable to distinguish whether it's satire or reality. And I notice this on April 1st every year, where people say these satirical April 1st, April Fool's jokes are getting increasingly plausible. So I really like to deliberately play with that. And it's funny now that I've built my own sort of cult following, people get it. But I've branched out into other platforms where I don't really have a lot of track record or history, TikTok being one of them. And you can see that a lot of people are unable to distinguish when something is clearly satire. So I think that it is a very useful vehicle for offering social commentary, and it's fun. And as an example, that America's Next Top Shaman headline was given to me by my friend Colin Wells from Veterans Walk and Talk. He had pitched it as a skit idea a while ago, and I love this in building community and building humor and fun because, yes, we need to have the serious conversations. There's lots of people having them. We also need to recognize the lighter side, right? There's that whole duality, binary. And I think about some of my most profound psychedelic experiences. I remember recently, like within the last 6 months, just laughing so hard at a meme that popped into my head that it was so cathartic and healing. And I remember like having to leave the room because my wife and dog were asleep and I was trying to be all low key and quiet. And I was having like fits of laughter. And we need to recognize the potential there, I think, personally.
Yeah. Speaking of the gift that keeps on giving, I think you said something along those lines in the story that you wrote for Lucid News about the Wonderland Conference. We're going to get into that, but first we're going to take a quick break. So for those of you who don't know, Double Blind began as a print magazine, and it's still at the heart of what we do. I spent my whole career as a journalist before starting Double Blind, reporting on psychedelics, cannabis, and drug policy more broadly for Rolling Stone, Vice, LA Weekly, Quartz. I did just about everything in journalism. I worked at CBS News covering breaking news, a major newspaper, small media startups, and if you haven't heard, journalism is in crisis. But we started Double Blind anyway because we believe in the value of good journalism journalism to educate and hold stakeholders accountable. We saw what happened in cannabis. Pioneers who put their lives on the line to get patients access to the medicine they needed, getting left behind because they didn't have the capital to compete in the newly regulated market. We've seen what's happened in mental health care and healthcare more broadly, whereby millions of people are suffering, don't trust their doctors, can't afford proper care, and just don't know what to do to get well. In our print magazine, we feature essays, investigations, photojournalism, and much more by world-class journalists who are going everywhere from the ayahuasca tourism industry in Peru to laboratories at leading universities. We're supporting people like you on their journey with psychedelics, and we're covering this movement as it unfolds. This is all made possible by our members who, in exchange for their support, get direct access to psychedelic experts to help them on their journeys of healing and growth, workshops, and a subscription to our beautiful print magazine. Subscribe today at doubleblindmag.com/membership. Okay, so first up, I'd like to talk about a story that you actually didn't report for Double Blind. You reported for Lucid News on the Wonderland Conference in Miami. First, before we get into that, I feel like I would be remiss to not say that one of Lucid News' founders, Ken Jordan, did unexpectedly pass last week. And I just want to give a shout out to him and the rest of the Lucid News team. Ken is one of these people who you might not have heard of him if you're not working in psychedelics, but he's spent much of his life doing incredible work, publishing journalism on the psychedelic movement long before, all the companies that we're probably going to talk about in this podcast existed. And he's just a deeply, deeply kind and amazing human. And the team at Lucid News is doing great work.
I'd love to offer a quick tribute to Ken and this piece that we're going to get into shortly about Wonderland. He actually took a big chance on me and sought me out and appreciated my perspective from videos that had been passed to him. And he really took the time to nurture me and to help me understand what gonzo journalism is. I was already doing it, but I didn't really have a sense of how to pitch this, how to format it for an audience. And Ken went so far out of his way to nurture me. And I think he's the definition of an unsung hero. So I got to give a ton of respect to him. And I came to develop a close friendship with him. So very, very sad, but also someone whose legacy will be remembered indefinitely.
Absolutely. So, let's get into it. So this story was on the Psychedelic Conference, Wonderland, which takes place annually in Miami every year. I think it's like the third or fourth year that it's done it. It hasn't been around for that long. And I just have to read the opening paragraph here of your story because it's too good. The psychedelic renaissance has entered its corporate trade show phase. For a satirist in need of plot lines, Wonderland is the gift that keeps on giving. It's as if the archetypal Florida man character discovered DMT and then decided to organize a massive convention around the potential commercial value of machine elves. In fact, I'm quite sure I saw him sandwiched between the numerous ketamine clinic booths, the Bitcoin billionaire posse, and the global pharmaceutical company reps who are all confident that they'll have something of value to offer the market by 2035.
Thank you.
I've never actually read a segment of an article like that on the podcast, but it just says it all. So talk to me about Wonderland. What the heck is going on down there in Miami, and what does this represent to you?
Yeah, so I got invited in blindly, and that's how I attribute much of the early success to Mycopreneur, is that I was essentially commenting as an anthropologist on Mars, if you're familiar with that idea of I had no connections within the quote.
Wonderland feels like Mars, honestly, even for people that have been covering especially for people that have been covering psychedelics for a long time. It's like, what on earth is going on here?
It's Miami in a nutshell right now. There's a lot of hustlers, a lot of opportunists. Everybody has had 6 exits, even though technically you can lose money on an exit. They never tell you that part. And
a lot of hot pink thongs.
A lot going on there. I see just a degree of overzealousness when something's new, something's edgy. And what's ironic is a lot of these larger companies that I've come to connect with or know or recognize from my experience on this quote trade show circuit, they've now pivoted out of psychedelics and are focusing on AI and on, other developments.
That really says it all.
It really does. You get these people who come up, they're like, I'm a DJ, I'm a Web3 entrepreneur, I'm into crypto, and I'm a psychedelic expert. And it's like, whoa. Let's just chill out, just focus on one of these avenues. We don't need to do everything. We don't need to know everything.
Firstly, I just want to chime in here and say that I don't know the founders of Wonderland. And I have met a lot of folks. I might get into trouble for saying this, but such it is. I've met a lot of folks in the quote unquote psychedelic industry who are well capitalized, people who have been in psychedelics for a long time and or consider themselves to be grassroots activists might have a problem with. And yet, when I talk to them about their why, they have had personally transformative experiences on psychedelics and really believe in the healing potential of psychedelics. So I want to sort of complicate or muddy this false dichotomy that we've created within the psychedelic industry between sort of quote unquote good actors who really care about psychedelics and their healing potential and bad actors who just see the shroom boom coming and want to make a ton of money. Because sometimes people that just look like suits also are good people who really care. And it's very possible that the founders of Wonderland are people who really, truly care. And that doesn't also mean that they're not kind of missing the mark.
Yeah, so I've come to know the founders pretty well, a whole bunch of the team. And that first opportunity where I was invited as press to go, it was actually at the invitation initially of a longtime steward of psychedelic community in Miami who takes a lot of issue with the quote, Johnny-come-lately new crowd. You know, when you've been hosting events since the 80s and have been putting your neck out there and curating psychedelic community when it wasn't popular, how are you going to feel when a convention comes to your home turf and gets all these highly capitalized founders? And to their credit, they're also extremely diplomatic and friendly. But I think that's one of the opportunities that I've received through being honest and quote, speaking my truth, is that a lot of these like old school people have sort of recognized like, oh, this person actually has paid attention for a long time, is familiar with the shoulders that we're standing on. There's this metaphor of we're standing on the shoulders of giants. And it really pisses off a lot of people when the newcomers or people trying to capitalize on the space just completely swoop in without recognizing this long lineage of both the indigenous and the underground. People who have been taking legal risks, who have been criminalized, people like Leonard Picard, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's one thing I want to get out of the way up quick, right up front. And I will say that part of, I think, what's given me a lot of opportunities, like with the medicalized, corporatized crowd, is I'm not out to create this false dichotomy of roots versus the suits. Of course, I occasionally find myself offering a hot take. But I think that, as you mentioned, like I met up with one of these people in Miami who is a suit, and we are at a super nice dinner in like a private dining room. And then I find out 2 days later, like the dude grew up in a gang in New Jersey and is part of the, you can't really judge people based on, hey, I saw your company and you're doing this and you're wearing this clothes. It's so easy to do. Everybody's rushing to do it, but also these groups aren't monolithic, right? Like I've often talked about, the underground oftentimes even turns on itself. There's this idea of like the roots and the suits, but like how many times have you seen underground groups throwing stones at other underground groups? And it's just human nature.
Yeah, so. And abuse and harm that's caused in the underground as well. It's really not that simple. But let's take a step back for a minute. You walked into Wonderland and like, what was going on there? Because, I appreciate you telling us a little bit about your experience with the founders, but there's a reason why people don't quite like the way the whole thing smells.
I think, I don't want to offer too much insight here, but I will say, like, even within that group, I think there's a lot of disagreement. And right, there's ultimately certain things make the headlines, and I would never defend the way that they handled certain situations, but I've also never organized a 8,000 person conference personally. I think everything's easier in hindsight, and it's really easy to be critical. And I have been very critical of them and directly to them. And I think that they appreciate the earnestness and honesty. There's something about not having an agenda to try to cancel or take down. And bad actors need to be called out. It's important. But I also think there's a degree of crying wolf, of people saying, well, because you're associated with this and that, then you're also bad. And it becomes ultimately disingenuous and counterproductive to the goal of trying to have a more transparent, impactful, meaningful, equitable psychedelic ecosystem when you start having all these personal rows and rivalries. So I think that they have taken the mantle as being sort of the Super Bowl of psychedelics, as I've heard them called, where it really is a little bit over the top. I've called it a psychedelic industry conference on steroids. I think that sort of hit the mark. And humorously enough, even though it was a quite critical piece that I wrote, they actually used that in their marketing and put it up on the website as like, Dennis Walker says this is a psychedelic industry event on steroids. I'm like, hey, that was actually meant to be a bit of a barb, but you got to do what you got to do. And what I noticed really from these quote opportunists, just in general, that are on the trade show circuit or the conference show circuit, is trying to squeeze value out of the community. And I don't really understand that. And what I noticed is people trying to target these high net worth individuals, the billionaire crowd, the well-funded companies, and to make sure they're really happy at the expense of everybody else. Like, it doesn't really matter if Joe Schmo has a bad experience as long as the high rollers come away feeling like they're going to invest. And I'm not speaking in specific to like one organization or one conference, but that's something I've noticed in general. And just as an example of that, like at Wonderland, I was tapped to do this stand-up comedy bit at a VIP after party that was being hosted by a family office, a organization with buku wealth, et cetera. And I had another show that was actually paying me, and I was running late and I was like, I have to leave. They're like, no, we need you to do this thing for our VIP guests. And I thought, you guys have all the money in the world here and no one's offered me a cent. And then, a counterbalance against that, you have these little grassroots community organizers like Reggie and Oakland Hyphae who are like, you want to MC the day? Let me pay you. Let me get your hotel. I'm like,
absolutely.
Why is it like that? Why are the big...
And I'll say, I really appreciate you bringing this up, because that is a criticism that we hear a lot in the grassroots. Specifically, I've heard this come up a lot at the Oakland Hyphae conferences. For those of you who don't know, Oakland Hyphae is an organization that's run by a man named Reggie Harris, and he has really put a lot of effort into platforming BIPOC leaders and grassroots leaders within psychedelics that haven't always been platformed at these more mainstream conferences that are happening in, the Marriott Convention Center. I mean, you can imagine, right? And it's, these big convention centers, or these big conferences at these big convention centers, will offer really generous honorariums to, primarily the white men that have been platformed in this movement for a long time. So like the Rick Doblins and the James Fadimans and the Paul Stamets. And then they, if they reach out to grassroots leaders at all, and more it's becoming on their radar that, we can't have a program that's just like all the Paul Stametses of the world. We need to get some grassroots people in here. We need to have people of color. We need to have indigenous folks. We need to have women. Then if they offer them an honorarium at all, it's much smaller than the honorarium that's been being given to these other people. They're put in less prominent, positions in the programming. They're not put on the main stage. Look, I run a business. I understand, Paul Stamets is a famous guy. It costs a lot of money to run a conference. Someone like him is probably going to move the needle on tickets in the way that someone who's less known might not. But at the same time, if we're really trying to imagine what it looks like to do business in a more equitable way, then we have to compensate people that are working their butts off every single day to uphold the traditional wisdom around these medicines fairly. And, I've also heard this criticism a lot when it comes to sort of the funding of psychedelic community, for example. There's a lot of grassroots activists that would like to see investors giving money to organizations like the Global Psychedelic Society, because we know that just having a psychedelic experience And then kind of being thrown back into the belly of the beast of your life, especially if you don't have people in your life who have a relationship with psychedelics, can be really challenging. And it's important to have a place to land where you can be with others and process and integrate. But we're not seeing that kind of capital go into psychedelic community and go into these grassroots organizations because there isn't the promise of a significant return on investment. Now, am I saying that, investors should be giving millions of dollars to psychedelic community? Not necessarily, but I think that for some of these extremely well-capitalized folks who are writing millions of dollar checks to pharmaceutical companies, it's really like a drop in the bucket for them to give an amount of money that would be incredibly meaningful to organizations that are really trying to imagine a psychedelic future where everyone is supported and everyone has access.
I also want to give credit to Wonderland for hopefully adapting and learning. And for example, I did a panel there this year with Reggie Harris and Mary Carrion, who's a senior editor at Double Blind. And they gave us the full latitude and permission to essentially say whatever we want. And even though it was a pretty early programming slot, we definitely didn't get the preferred main stage treatment. We had almost every journalist that was there covering the event was there for us. And it got publicized in LA Weekly. Jimmy from LA Weekly at the time said that it was his favorite panel of the weekend, and et cetera, et cetera. But that opens the door to more of these opportunities. That opened the door in a way to South by Southwest. So I think we definitely had the same panel, but we had already been accepted for that. But what I want to recognize right now, and I think it's an important sentiment to carry forward for everyone in the psychedelic space, is a lot of people and companies haven't reached their final form. So like trying to write them off and say like, you're bad, you're this. It's like they haven't even reached their final form. So what really counts in my book is, did you adapt? Did you learn from a mistake? Did you receive the criticism, or did you double down and try to pretend it wasn't happening? And I think we're seeing that right now. There are various organizations, I'm sure we'll get into them, who are sort of seeing the long tail of effects right now by trying to pretend things didn't happen and that they were perfect. And this media narrative that they've crafted is going to be the only narrative. And then it starts to bubble up to the surface. Well, there's all these other things that happen. So I do think it's important we recognize, though, that people and companies haven't reached their final form. If they're being bad actors, we need to call them out. But I don't personally agree with the whole idea of like canceling and bringing people down. I think there needs to be what we've seen some of our mutual friends do, restorative justice. There needs to be some kind of like community dialogue. And if organizations and people are eschewing that and shutting it down, well, that's problematic in my book.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective. And I want to, credit Wonderland for listening as well and seemingly growing and changing over time. And I also am on the train of calling in and not calling out. Obviously, there are certain violations, that really, there's just no going back if someone's, if there's like a sexual assault or something that's really harmful, then, that's just, you can't come back from that. But when we talk about all these people that, many of whom probably are well-meaning, who come into the psychedelic landscape and, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed because they had their transformative ayahuasca experience, and ayahuasca whispered to them in the dark that it's their life's dharma to work in psychedelics, but they just never really took the time to understand the very complicated dynamics. And so how do we find a way to come together and engage in what we at Double Blind like to call critical, compassionate discourse? So if you're going to just come on our Instagram and troll us and say things that are frankly really mean about me or other work that we've done, we don't have a lot of patience for that. But you could say something that, is really critical, and we're here for it. Like, let's talk about it.
Yeah, I got to give you a shout out for having thick skin, because you do take on pretty challenging, often controversial topics, one of which I've written about. And being a journalist and putting yourself out there, being any kind of public figure, especially in an emerging space that has so many different ideologies and perspectives attached to it, it takes really thick skin. So my unsolicited advice for people who want to like get out there more is work on growing your skin, because people are going to try to criticize, poke you apart. I had this experience yesterday with an article I published with Reality Sandwich, which you just inherently know when you put something out, you're going to have some people offer some criticism, and that's valid. But like 5 different people criticized that I spelled the name of one place wrong, out of this whole article that I'm not even getting paid for. I'm doing them a favor, essentially, trying to build and grow together. And I'm friends with some of the management, et cetera, that I just know that I'm going to, get critiqued. And that comes with the territory. So I'm still learning. I catch myself slipping. But then the other bit is the limitations of social media as a communications platform are becoming increasingly recognizable. Like you cannot get across the amount of nuance and diplomacy and efficacy in a 40-character tweet as you can just sitting down with someone, having a one-on-one conversation. And that's why I'm so bullish on podcasting. And a great example, I had a internet spat recently. It's very few and far between if I have one. And I felt like I needed to defend a satirical piece I made, which was widely celebrated. Everybody loved it except for a small vocal minority who took issue with it. And I realized I can't defend all of these, this cluster bomb, if you will, at one time. But I can invite one of them to sit down on the podcast and to have a long-form, nuanced dialogue. And I think we need that more than ever right now. We're not going to solve differences of opinion on Twitter or on Instagram, as far as I can tell. A chaotic time in general in the world, and psychedelics have chosen to enter the mainstream at this most interesting, auspicious, challenging time in our cultural landscape. And I want to double down on the fact that I think it's terrific that this is happening right now, that so many people are interested in them. And in particular, it's so grassroots driven. And that's one bit I don't think a lot of the corporate actors understand. They're stacking their chips with this FDA regulated framework, biotech, big investment. There's probably a place for that. But I'm already recognizing these companies pivoting out of that. And a great example is one this week, which when Psychedelic Alpha, which does a great job as an industry monitor and reporting on data, very much tied to the corporate medical side of psychedelics, they were told by this company not to refer to what they're doing, their candidates, as psychedelics in the press release. They were actually some other title because of the baggage attached to psychedelics. And I've hosted a number of these quote, corporatedelic CEOs, some of whom have really intelligent perspectives and personal psychedelic experiences. They just so happen to be at the helm of a multi-million-dollar biotech company. And I think we need more nuanced conversation around this kind of stuff where they're developing next generation novel molecules for very specific indications. And I'm not an expert on this. I'm fascinated by it. But I think it goes to show that a lot of people trying to cash in and make a quick buck on psychedelics do not understand the landscape. Like, how are you going to, for example, with the Oregon model, try to charge $3,500 for a 6-hour session or whatever, when I can get them for free from my neighbor, and my neighbor already knows my favorite music and my favorite food. So I think we need to invest more in building up that landscape. And I often say these biotech, drug development, psychedelic corporate bros are putting the cart way before the horse. We already have super effective substances, LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, MDMA, et cetera. They're really good at what they do. So how are you going to improve upon them by orders of magnitude such that it justifies $100 million when,
well, right.
Yeah, that's my take on
it. I mean, for folks who want to understand a little more about that whole thing, you can check out our episode with Shayla Love. We talked to her all about psychedelic patents, but suffice it to say that biotech company X isn't necessarily developing novel compound Y because it's more effective than psilocybin. You can't raise a lot of money for putting something that's in the public domain through the FDA approval process. And also, yeah, you're right. Doctors might not want to prescribe something that they know is psilocybin, or patients might not want to take it. So instead, they're going to call it AXYZ359. And slap a label on it that looks like Advil.
I mean, I think in 5 years, 10 years, like even the word psychedelic has been stretched to its limits. And I've written about this, and I'd like to bring this perspective up more. When we have the quote psychedelic renaissance, which I've never agreed with that title, then how are ketamine in a clinic, MDMA in a clinic, DMT, smoking 5-MeO DMT in the, down in Mexico in Tepoztlan, ayahuasca, et cetera. These are radically, wildly different experiences. So to me, it's really stretching it thin and disingenuous to try to put them all under this one umbrella. And this has been written about in academic literature now. And I recently had the good fortune of spending a week with Jonathan Ott, who is a legendary psychonaut who's very intentionally kind of exited from the whole fracas that we're seeing now and has been tucked away, living sort of a hermetic lifestyle since the 80s, and is a contemporary of Albert Hofmann and Terence McKenna, knew Rick Doblin and Amanda Fielding in the 80s and 90s, et cetera, probably before then. And he straight up claims like that psychedelic is a terrible name for what we're trying to assign the signifier label to. That psychedelics, according to him, ended in 1971. It connotes and signifies an era. We have left that era. And this individual also coined the term entheogen.
Has he been to Burning Man?
I don't think he has, actually. I mean, and I kind of share a lot of his sentiments. And I'd love to get into this briefly, but I just want to mention Jonathan Ott, legend, and he's extremely critical and has he could have cashed in and created a biotech company and been the guy. He could have been the headline speaker everywhere. Zero interest in it, doing a lot of grassroots, underground, low-key work. I think that's wonderful. I went to school in San Francisco, which is how I get a lot of these plot lines of the startup tech bro who's microdosing. I was there from 2007 to 2012. I was a full-blown psychonaut. There was so little interest in pop culture there, even in San Francisco, especially in the tech circles. And I find it humorous now that a lot of these people I've kept in touch with are now pivoting in literally a decade after. When I was trying to share these things and explain them, they saw it as the territory of hippies on Haight Street, of the anti-establishment types, which, to be fair, they still are in a lot of ways. But I just think it's really rich for satire that now that there's a dollar value and there's Time Magazine writing about them, now they want to know about them. And now I'm I'm sorry, but if you pivot in like that, again, I think that there's room for everyone. It's a big tent. Just don't try to be a thought leader, business leader, go out on your soapbox and raise money. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing people who did not care at all about psychedelics, not as a rule, but oftentimes 5-10 years ago, going out now trying to be on the conference circuit and trying to launch a brand. And I would be very wary of that personally.
So I want to talk for a moment about your reporting for us on MAPS's sort of rebranding of their public benefit corporation to Lykos Therapeutics. Now, I want to name before we get into this that this is a very touchy and tender topic. It's a very polarizing topic. And just this week, there was a highly critical investigation into MAPS and Rick Doblin that was published in Business Insider. And I, as a journalist, am not going to, I don't feel right about getting into all the allegations in that story because I just don't have any way of, independently fact checking those since I read it. But I do think that what I'll say, as a person, as an individual, not as a journalist, who's had her feet on the ground in the psychedelic space is I don't think that a lot of people who are really sort of deeply embedded in the psychedelic movement were shocked by this story. Maybe people were shocked by some of the specifics, but there's been sort of a sentiment for a while that people who are really passionate about psychedelics but don't work in the industry look to MAPS as, sort of the gold standard for destigmatizing psychedelics and making them legitimate as a Western medicine. And yet there is kind of a lot happening behind the curtain over there, and a lot of sort of internal feelings about some of the moves that they have made in recent years.
So this is the subject right now, and I think it's going to be the subject at least for the next 2 months because there's a FDA decision expected on August 11th, which many people in the more corporate psychedelic, medicalized psychedelic space are looking to that date specifically as sort of a watershed moment. Whether or not that's accurate, it has a lot of importance tied to that decision in terms of...
Well, it'll be the first psychedelic therapy that's ever approved by the FDA.
It's a huge moment. Yes, it's a huge moment. I also want to borrow from people I know from that camp who share my opinion in the sense that as soon as we start looking to the government to regulate, we've kind of lost the pulse, as though the people who started and furthered the drug war for the last 50 odd years are the authoritative body we should be listening to on this subject. So that's one take. But I think it's extremely important to give the critical and especially the victimized voices and perspectives, people who have experienced harm and who have strong perspectives and opinions. We need to give them the platform and the opportunity to share this. I think a big part of the tumultuousness that's unfurling right now is that there has been a code of silence just in general. There's been this sense of we need to get psychedelic therapies across the line. I've heard multiple, what I refer to as carnival barkers, use this exact phrasing as though they have a playbook that they're drawing from. We need to get psychedelics across the line. And I've taken issue with that statement. Like, what line? Like the line between rigidly hierarchically controlled pill popping in a clinical infrastructure and authoritarianism? Like, psychedelics, to me, and mushrooms in particular, which is kind of my area of expertise I focused on, they belong to the marginalized. So like, as soon as we're looking towards the top of the pyramid and the power structure to tell us how we should feel about these, how we can interact with them, I think we've already lost the thread there. And someone recently, who I don't want to misattribute the quote, but I did see, they said, how can I be so open about my work with mushrooms, et cetera? It's because I don't need white man's laws to tell me what to do. They're not for me. They're not written with me in mind. And I think that is a shared sentiment.
I don't know if that was Gabrielle Williams.
I think it was. It was.
I've heard her say that. We've had her on Double Blind, and she's amazing.
It's the absolute truth. So as far as the controversy with MAPS, first of all, I think that there is a lot of interest in people attaching themselves to controversy. And as I found out firsthand, and I don't particularly seek it out, but it actually drives a lot of engagement. It drives a lot of attention. Now, I don't want to dismiss people's perspectives who actually have been victims of abuse as attention seeking. I think it's extremely critical and important that these open hearings happen. So like, there is an open hearing, as far as I understand, with the FDA. I think that's long overdue. I think that we could have avoided a lot of challenges as a collective if people were given credibility and space when these things were happening. So that being said, I don't have any affiliation with MAPS. I don't have any, really stake in there. And I have written a critical piece about them, but I'm also friends with a lot of MAPS. I think it's the same sort of monolith of people say, as an organization, they have this wrong and that wrong, and they did this wrong and they did that wrong. I'm personally most interested in the cultural element of psychedelics, increasingly so in policy. And I look at like my incursion or my entree into the quote broader MAPS ecosystem has been one of empathy and grace and cool opportunities and people nurturing and developing me. And I think that hopefully more people can see that there is a lot of good in an organization. They happen to be at the absolute forefront and vanguard of one of the most polarizing, incredibly important moments in psychedelic history and in broader healthcare history, one could say. So like, they've put a huge target on themselves for all kinds of different criticism and controversy. And I think that some of it is absolutely legitimate. And I've offered what I consider to be legitimate criticism. And it actually ostracized me from some of my connections there. And yet other ones were very empathetic and received it and were texting me and saying like, I'm glad you said it, or this or that or whatever. And I don't want to be the one who's in the middle trying to definitively qualify an organization or an individual. But from my own perspective, I've benefited greatly from their invitations and opportunities to speak and to publish with them. And it doesn't mean that they're the right organization all the time, making all the correct choices. They probably,
right. Yeah. It sort of goes to what we were talking about before, where we need to be able to have critical conversations. And we saw something similar happen in cannabis, right? Where people were so intent on legalizing cannabis, legitimizing cannabis as a medicine, that people didn't want to have critical conversations about the downsides of cannabis either, right? The fact that it can be abused, it can be harmful. And, we just don't want to see the same thing happen in psychedelics. And I've been pleased to see that, especially in the last year or two, more and more, we have seen headlines in the mainstream media talking about the potential harms of psychedelics, talking about some mistakes that have been made. both within clinical trials and also harm that's been caused in the underground. And yeah, I mean, so yeah, I just don't know who's really going to be listening to this podcast. And so I just want to kind of rewind a little and just give some context, which is MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And it's a psychedelic, well, for a long time, it was just a nonprofit, and now they have a for-profit arm as well. But they're the primary organization that's behind getting MDMA legalized as a therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. And they were started in 1986 by a man named Rick Doblin. And this Business Insider piece is really criticizing, some of the ways in which the clinical trials were designed, but it's also really coming at Rick Doblin personally. And again, I don't want to get into every single allegation in that story because as a journalist, I haven't had the time to go through that story myself, line by line. But what I can say about MAPS is that they started as a very small nonprofit in the 80s, headed by Rick with a big dream and a big vision. And they grew exponentially because they were at the forefront of a movement that a lot of people were excited about. And all of us knew we didn't know everything that was in that story, but I think everyone in the industry knew that they were going through some growing pains and that inevitably they were going to go through some growing pains because they went from being less than 20 people in Santa Cruz to being basically a pharmaceutical company overnight. And, speaking more broadly, not about MAPS, one thing I can say about psychedelics and working in psychedelics is that, when it comes to workplace culture, is that it gets really sticky and really complicated, and some things come up that, might not come up in other industries. And so I'm just going to say that these are problems that have occurred in other psychedelic companies as well, right? Where psychedelics, one of the amazing things about them, and again, I'm not defending anyone's behavior, but I'm just speaking broadly about what I've observed in psychedelic work culture more broadly. One of the things about psychedelics is that they melt boundaries, right, between people. And this is one of the things that makes them potentially really incredible tools for cultivating connection with yourself and other people and a sense of sort of conscientiousness about your place in the broader ecosystem that is this moment. And also is one of the reasons why we have to be really careful with them, because it means that there is potential for harm, intentional and not intentional, right? And when you are working at a psychedelic company and you're going to Burning Man and you're all tripping on acid together and you're biking around and people are taking their clothes off, I mean, yeah, things are going to happen that don't happen at other businesses. And especially, when you have a small company that is growing exponentially overnight, maybe there's not an HR department. Maybe people are being encouraged to talk about things that have to do with their personal lives. And I can say as someone who's worked in more corporate environments and felt very oppressed by them, right? Like I worked at CBS News and I felt like I couldn't share with people. This was before Burning Man everyone knew Burning Man. And I felt like I couldn't tell people at my job that I went to Burning Man and that I like to do acid. And I felt very oppressed. And I think a lot of people feel very oppressed in corporate work environments where they can't sort of be themselves. And there's this sort of arbitrary division between your personal life and your professional life. And also, those mechanisms have been put in place for a reason.
Yeah, it's such a loaded subject area. And it's one which we're seeing with the underground too, like especially a lot of these retreat centers, these stories of abuse are bubbling up. And, these are oftentimes large groups of people. And maybe there's bad actors that are embedded with these broader ecosystems of people. I'd like to think that the overall benefit that some of these organizations are offering completely outweigh the harms, but it doesn't mean the harms don't exist and that we don't need to reconcile with them and that people need to be held accountable. So I'm firmly on that one. And I think it's really important also to level your criticism. It's something I try to do a lot. And to me, if you're just constantly trying to sound the alarm and call out the faults, this, that, or the other, I don't really take them as seriously as if you were able to give credit when there is credit due. And I think that we've divided ourselves into this dichotomy of you need to point out all the criticisms, and maybe there's a role for that. Like, I'm not here to tell people how they should conduct themselves online, but I'm just saying that I would take the criticism a lot more seriously if it wasn't just constantly targeting and constantly, especially when there's relatively petty things. I think that ultimately serves as a counterproductive motivator, and it detracts from your overall message when you're trying to. One thing that I really don't understand is this sense of like gotcha journalism of trying to go through people's 40-year history and pull out one sentence that they didn't like, especially when it's ambiguous and subjective. Like, in some cases, we can say, like, if there was a serious harm that happened, that needs to be reconciled with, pointed out, and dealt with. But if it's this other thing, that this caused a microaggression or abuse because I interpret it in such a way, well, like, maybe separate that out into a different category. When you lump it all together, that's my personal take on it. And it's one that I've also heard reflected back from the community. And ultimately, in my position, when I do offer criticism or something I want to say, I think that there's maybe more gravity in some ways to it, in the sense that I'm not out here just looking for faults. Like, I want to point out the upside and the benefit, and this is all very good. But again, we like to paint things as monoliths, as either this company is bad, this person is bad, or this person is good and they're a hero. And I've asked that question on Twitter and gotten myriad results of like, why is Maps so divisive and polarizing? Where's the middle ground? Like, so often you just hear people who are, on the trying to criticize and bring down Maps, or you have people staunchly defending them, saying they're the greatest organization in the world. Where is this middle ground? And I kind of, in general, want to be in the middle ground, because I think a lot of these critics have very important perspectives. I think being skeptical, being critical, and in some cases taking direct action is completely necessary. But pick your battles. I think people just want to, if they find fault with someone, they want to point that fault out as often as possible. And I disagree with that. I don't think that's the best way forward as a community.
Yeah. Thank you. And I have to say, I mean, I'm scared to even put this podcast out because I feel like a lot of people are going to have opinions, and I feel like no matter what we say on this, it's not going to be right. And I also just want to reiterate that Dennis and I think I can speak for both of us, are absolutely not trying to diminish the seriousness of some of the accusations and allegations that have been made about Maps and other organizations. And we're not trying to diminish the fact that when harm is caused, it really does need to be, people need to be held accountable, and that those harms need to be rectified. So not trying to diminish that at all. I think what we're just saying is, let's introduce some nuance to the conversation. Can we hold a multiplicity of truths? I mean, there are people who have been working at Maps for a long time who really care and are really trying to do good work. I don't think that like every single person that works at that organization should be held responsible for every single thing that happened in the organization, including things that they didn't know about.
Yeah, I have to offer the perspective, which I've also said frequently, is I've been a psychonaut for a long time. I had never heard of Maps until my first Wonderland. Straight up, I lived in the Bay Area, and they were hosting psychedelic sciences and throwing events. And I think that we need to recognize this is a global movement, and they certainly represent that. They're doing research in dozens of countries, as far as I understand. I don't try to super closely monitor what Maps is doing, believe it or not. I think there are people who are watchdogs, and we should listen to them. And like, great example, like a few of them, like Nishay, if you're familiar, Devino, great lecturer and researcher, a writer who's been openly extremely critical of Maps. And I consider Nishay a personal friend. We text, we hang out. It doesn't mean I'm always going to get it right. We had a Twitter feud recently, and guess what? We took it offline. We texted with each other, and I want to put myself out there as someone who's willing to take on these difficult topics, but it doesn't mean I'm an expert in what Maps has or hasn't done. I'm purely speaking from a sort of anthropologist on Mars perspective, that I got thrust into this psychedelic ecosystem. And all of a sudden, next thing you know, people are like, you need to have an informed perspective. You need to choose a side. You need to know about this. And like, that to me is very burdensome. Like my primary focus, believe it or not, is on creating satire, being as hilarious as possible, trying to create joy, trying to stoke that fire. And I inevitably get inducted into the orbit of these broader conversations. And then it ends up becoming almost like a core part of my public identity. And I'm trying to offer my perspectives from what I've seen, but it doesn't mean that my perspectives are more valuable than someone like Nishay or some of the other critical perspectives. And I've been super, super open about the fact that, like, for example, what they're asking for is an FDA hearing and public input. Absolutely, that should happen. Why are we going to have these sort of like closed door meetings, right? With these moneyed lobbying and interest groups meeting behind closed doors and wealthy enclaves deciding public policy. Unfortunately, that seems to be the way that things work. But especially with psychedelics and with grassroots movements, I don't know how much sway and power those small groups have anymore when you have these disruptive grassroots organizations all over the planet that don't really even need the funding or the permission to do it. They're doing it because they see it as the right thing. So I'm more focused on trying to be cool in my community, build friends, build bridges instead of burning them. Occasionally you have to burn a bridge. Occasionally people want to come at you and make you into whatever projection they have of you. And like, that's fine. I really don't need to go out, I think, and prove myself to everyone all the time. Like, I'm going to stay in my lane, keep doing my thing. The fact is that people ask me about my perspectives and I give them, but take them with a grain of salt. I'd way rather be a satirist having fun, and you can't keep all the people happy all the time. And then to round out that thought, if there have been serious harms and abuses, the last thing any organization should do is try to sweep those under the rug. They should be recognized. You should be held accountable, and you should adapt. And yeah, that's my take on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, several years ago, people started asking me what I wanted psychedelics to look like in the next, 5 to 10 years, and how I thought that the movement should unfold. And I often tried to answer in the most pragmatic way I could, which is jurisdictions are decriminalizing more and more. More and more, well-capitalized people are coming into the space and investing in pharmaceutical companies and trying to get psychedelics through the FDA approval process. Like, it doesn't matter what I want, or what I think. Like, firstly, who am I? But secondly, like, we can't change what's happening. Like, this is happening. Jurisdictions are going to keep decriminalizing, and well-capitalized people are going to continue to start pharmaceutical companies and try to develop these drugs. So we have to all communicate about that, and we have to, just look honestly at what's unfolding before us. I don't think saying I'm pro-decriminalization and I'm anti-pharma makes pharma go away. And I don't think saying I'm pro-pharma and I don't think there should be decrim makes decrim go away. It's all going to keep going on no matter what. So we'll see how it unfolds. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm grateful that platforms like Double Blind exist. I'm grateful that organizations like Oakland Hyphae exist. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to interview mushroom entrepreneurs. So I think pegging one organization or one regulatory body as like the decisive, most important. Yes, there's gravity, there's relevance attached to these decisions, but like in the long scheme, the long run, it's way more important about the grassroots actors, about the unsung heroes, the people like Ken Jordan or like Ophelia Chong. I got to be on a panel with her, right? I know she's another stakeholder in Double Blind. Like, there's so many people just doing incredible work that don't get the podium all the time. And I don't think half of us want it. I sort of have a proclivity for being able to communicate publicly. I feel very comfortable on stage, and therein I get invited to do stuff. But I never tried to like elbow my way into an opportunity. I was always creating low-key, weird content for a cult following.
And then you elbowed your way into this opportunity. No, I'm just kidding. We called you.
Yeah, I'm grateful for the opportunity. Yeah, thank you.
So we're going to be moving on to our favorite part of the show called Trip Tips. First, I have to give the disclaimer I always give, which is we are not doctors, we are not psychiatrists, we are not researchers, we're not astronauts, we're journalists. So we're going to do our best to answer these questions, but take it with a grain of salt. Dennis, you want to pull something from our community?
I would love to. I see right here. Let's see. Here we go. I'm ready to have a psychedelic experience, but I really don't know anyone. My wife isn't supportive. I just don't know where to look, where to begin. How do I find other people to connect with who have had these experiences before? I'm so glad you asked. And what I would say is probably the best way, top of mind, is try to connect with a psychedelic society chapter in your city. They're all over the planet. If you don't live in a city that has one, they usually have online meetings. And just starting there, Global Psychedelic Society is a great resource, GPS. And you'll be able to log on. If you just Google Global Psychedelic Society, you'll see all the different places around the world that have a psychedelic society, which generally means they have community meetups, they have resources available, and you'll be able to meet with people directly. Now, a word of caution here is if you have a wife who's not supportive, just be aware that if you are interested in pursuing psychedelics, that might fundamentally alter the dynamics of your relationship. And this is something that, quite frankly, happens a lot. I've hosted a number of retreat operators, and they say this is something that happens. It's like one partner will come down to our center without the other, and then it may alter the relationship. So I just think it's a word of caution there. But if it's something you're called to, that's your calling, and there are resources out there. So I think it's important to hold multiple possibilities and perspectives at once, that psychedelics can both be tremendously therapeutic, beneficial, and transformative, but that doesn't mean that they carry zero risk. So it's best to meet people, learn the landscape, read. I'd also recommend Arrowwood. Arrowwood.org is a wonderful resource where you can read trip reports, you can connect with different authors and journalists who are writing about psychedelics and learn the science, the chemistry, the cultural history, etc. So that's my response, top of mind. And I wish you the best of luck and good fortune in your journey.
I don't have that much more to add other than that people are pretty friendly in the psychedelic community. I think you might be surprised to find out whether you're interested in working in psychedelics or you just want psychedelic community, how quickly you can sort of fall into knowing what's going on in the space and familiarizing yourself with the various conferences that are going on and the festivals that everyone is going to. There's almost like a psychedelic circuit, especially if you're willing to travel. You'll see a lot of the same faces at Horizons, Breaking Convention in London. We've mentioned Oakland Hi-Fi a bunch of times, but it's such an amazing organization, and they do conferences in California, and they're doing one in Jamaica later this year. So, I mean, you can really show up at these places by yourself and just, be curious and be nice, and you will meet people. And I think that that's one of the most beautiful things about the psychedelic community. A lot of open-hearted people, but also, always have to be critical. So if you meet, a stranger or someone that you don't know that well, and they're inviting you to a ceremony or they're offering to sell you drugs, I mean, obviously always got to raise an eyebrow and make sure that you really trust that person. Don't buy drugs from strangers, folks. That's my advice. Anyway, if you want the chance for us to answer your questions on the Double Blind Magic Hour, you can email them to magichour@doubleblindmag.com. And before we wrap up, Dennis, I wanted to invite you to do a couple minutes of meditation with us. We have resident facilitators at Double Blind who host amazing integration circles, cannabis ceremonies, breath work, you name it. And they've also prepared some meditations for our podcast listeners. Is that something that you're open to?
I would love to. Thank you for the opportunity.
Hello and welcome. I'm Sky Weaver, resident facilitator at Double Blind, and I invite you into a little bit of breath work here today. So the breath we're going to use is coming in through the nose and out through the mouth. So we're going to inhale through the nose, a little extra inhale here, And exhale. Nice and long through the mouth. That's it. Again, inhale through the nose. A little gasp. And exhale through the mouth. Right, and on that exhale, just letting everything out. A couple more times. Inhale through the nose. Exhale. Good, one more time. Beautiful, and you can continue doing that as I explain just a little bit about this, that this is a beautiful breath practice that you can do to calm your nervous system. Anytime I'm feeling anxious about anything, in fact, preparing for this video today, I did my breath work. So inhaling in, one more time, and exhale. Soften that jaw and that tongue, one more. Nice, and just allowing the breath to return back to normal. Wiggling the body a little bit. I'm a big fan of wiggling. And welcome back. We'll see you soon.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share for now?
I just want to say thank you. I want to say mushrooms are awesome. I hope that people can find the joy.
Shout out to mushrooms.
Big fan. And remember that it's not just psilocybin mushrooms. There's so many beautiful, uplifting, medicinal mushrooms, lion's mane, cordyceps, reishi. All mushrooms are magic. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. It's going to be okay. I know it doesn't look great right now for a lot of reasons, but I have a fundamental belief in the humanity that we will win and that good people are good people, and let's take care of each other. So that's my parting shot there.
Let's take care of each other. That's a nice place to end. And where can folks find you?
Yeah, check me out at mycopreneur.com, mycopreneur.com. Check me out at Mycopreneur Official on Instagram, where I post my satire, which is also funny and not just, loaded, difficult conversations, but it's the fun stuff. So I invite you to join me. If you have plot lines and ideas, I would absolutely love to hear them, because trust me, it is fun to have fun. If you can have fun, you can create fun content. Life is good. It's a beautiful place. We're lucky to be here. And I'm very fortunate and lucky to have been hosted here on the Double Blind Magic Hour. So thank you again, Shelby.
Thanks, Dennis. Wow. So I knew that was going to be a juicy, is that the word I want to use? Juicy conversation. Dennis obviously is incredibly familiar with what is happening within the psychedelic ecosystem and, plays kind of two roles. Role number one is journalist. Role number two is satirist and person who has opinions about the things that are unfolding. And, the intention behind this podcast, as I think some of you know, is to have really hard conversations and to bring hard conversations that are being had behind closed doors among people within the psychedelic ecosystem into the light. And there's a lot of nuance, and we're here for it. We're here for those hard conversations, but we think that it's important that people who are really passionate about psychedelics and about psychedelic reform understand what it is that people are talking about, within the space. People who are, really passionate as well, but also have a lot of complicated feelings about how things are unfolding. Thank you so much to everyone for listening. We really appreciate your support, time, and attention. If you want to read some of our incredible journalism on the fascinating world of psychedelics or get your tripping questions answered, we have so many free articles on our website, doubleblindmag.com. We work with absolutely amazing journalists and photographers who travel all around the world interviewing indigenous stewards of plant medicines, researchers, therapists, politicians, and it's all made possible with the support of our membership, which comes with a subscription to our beautiful print magazine, access to a private community of psychedelic lovers, workshops with psychedelic experts, and discounts to our classes where we teach you how to grow mushrooms, microdose, and so much more. You can give our membership a try for free for 1 month. If you want to hang out with us and see what it's all about, just visit doubleblindmag.com/membership. We'll also include that in the show notes. If you have thoughts about what we talked about today, I'm sure a lot of people will. You have any suggestions about who should come on? There are so many ways to hit us up. You can email us at magichour@doubleblindmag.com or visit doubleblindmag.com/magichour. If you want to partner with us and help make this podcast possible, you can email partnerships@doubleblindmag.com and mention that you heard about it here for 10% off 3 months of advertising. We only partner with brands we believe in and who align with our values. So I just want to state that up front. You can find us on all the social platforms at Double Blind Mag. I also want to give a shout out to the amazing folks at Human Content who are producing this podcast and helping make it possible. They do a lot of great podcasts other than this one. You can check them out on Instagram and TikTok at Human Content Pods. Thanks to all of the listeners who are leaving wonderful feedback and awesome reviews. It makes a huge difference. So if you haven't yet and you feel called to, we invite you to subscribe, comment on your favorite podcasting app or on YouTube, and share with all your friends and family. The full video episodes are up every week on YouTube at Double Blind. I'm your host, Shelby Hartman. Special thanks to our guest correspondent, Dennis Walker. Our executive producers are Aaron Corney, Rob Goldman, Shanti Brooke, and Alex Field from the Double Blind team, who also edits the show. Our engineer is Jason Portizo. Our music is by the lovely women of Oma. To learn more about our Double Blind Magic Hour program disclaimer and ethics policy and submission verification and licensing terms, you can go to doubleblindmag.com/magic hour. Now let's take you out on Pachamama by Sage and Sun. Pachamama, 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 Madre Tierra, me recuerda, Grande Espíritu, me recuerda, Grande Espíritu. Thanks for watching. And if you're thinking, gosh, I really need more Double Blind Magic Hour in my life, well, you can start listening now by clicking on that playlist button right over there. New episodes are out every Monday, so please subscribe and join us each week on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.